Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can click subscribe and rate and review at the YouTube channel, as well as wherever you listen to podcasts, like Good Pods, Apple, Google, Spotify. Those are the main places you can find the podcast, but also the YouTube channel is a great one for exclusive quick take videos, as well as more interviews, and that is the Sonic Cinema Podcast. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Patrons are finally going to get my best scores of 2021 podcast this month. It's been a long time coming, but I'm finally ready to talk about that. And you can also get sneak previews of a film score that I wrote for Brian Ackley's Player PhD there. The album, that's film score, which is a fitting that we're going to talk about film music and composition a little bit on this one. That one is going to be coming out probably around August. It's going to be on Bandcamp, but you can check out some early looks at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So today's guest is one that I've wanted to have on the podcast since I first was a guest on the Piecing It Together podcast that he hosts last year when we talked about Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And then I also joined him for a discussion on Matt Reeves' The Batman earlier this year. And he is also, in addition to being a movie podcaster, he is actually a composer in his own right, as well as he's got a few film scores under his belt as well. Please welcome to the podcast, David Rosen. Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is going to be a fun conversation for sure.
Yeah. It's funny because of the fact that, like, when we first started to connect on Twitter, last year, it was funny because of the fact that it's such a weird pipeline. Usually you have, of course, podcasters, sometimes they try to do films and stuff like that. They try again to film. And it's like the idea that, like, there's another podcaster out there who talks about movies, but also has this other life as a composer is really kind of fascinating to me. So before we get started on that discussion about the podcast and your work as a composer in general and how you were inspired to get into that, where can people find you online?
Yeah, there's a bunch of places, but I'll stick to the main two. Piecingpod.com is where you can find my podcast, Piecing It Together, and links to everything, revolving around that. And then my music is by davidrosen.com. And those are also my Twitter handles for both of those particular things. So you can find my music all over the place, obviously iTunes and Spotify and all those kinds of things. My podcast on all the major podcast apps too.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is Piecing It Together. As a former guest, I really enjoyed that. I really enjoy the structure of the show. What was it that, and you've got a couple of other podcasts, and feel free to bring those up as well. But with Piecing It Together, what was the inspiration behind that concept of that type of movie podcast?
Well, I knew I didn't want to just be a movie review podcast. Like, there's so many good ones out there, and I already was so busy at the time with all the various stuff I was involved with. And so I didn't need to just start a movie podcast just to start one. I wanted it to be its own thing and something different. And I was trying to think of ways that I generally like to talk about movies. And I do tend to talk about movies in a this meets this meets this. And I didn't want to call it the This Meets This podcast. And so I just started brainstorming on different ways to take that and create a theme around it. And I ended up coming up with the whole puzzle pieces thing because I do like puzzles. And so it all kind of just worked together in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's something that I really appreciate about another podcast that both of us have been on, binge movies, which is this. It takes this simple idea of how people discuss movies and makes that basically the structure of the show, and it really asks you to look at movies in a way that is both very intuitive to how we look at things. I mean, I've always looked at movies by, how is this movie compared to this movie? This reminds me of this, and this reminds me of this. But at the same time, making it a bit deeper. And I know one of the things that when we were talking about Shang-Chi, like we had so many various different inspirations for that. I mean, and the fact that you brought up Star Wars, and I mean, I adore Star Wars, but for some reason that just was not on my radar as an inspiration. But you think about it with regards to that movie, it makes sense. And then you brought up video games, and we brought up John Woo, Jackie Chan, and all of these different influences that it's funny how looking at a movie through that context can really help you both appreciate it as well as think about it in terms of, so it's inspired by it feels like it's inspired by these movies. Does it hold up to what inspired it? And I think that's one of the things that I really took away, especially thinking about the two movies that we did, Shang-Chi and the Batman. That was one of the things that really I connected with when it came to thinking about those movies in respect to how the structure of your show works.
Yeah, and that was a thing, like, when I started the show, I knew this, but, like, especially after 5 years of doing it, I know it even more. Being inspired by something is not a bad thing. And sometimes people will be like, oh, yeah, there's no original ideas anymore. Like, they're just doing, whatever over again. And it's like, no, everything, even the stuff from back in the day, was all inspired by something. And it's just part of being creative is synthesizing all of your influences and putting it together into something new. And so I think this is just celebrating that.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. I mean, and you're absolutely right when you talk about it. It's like, there are no new people complain all the time about there are no new ideas, but the fact of the matter is, it's like that, like you said, that kind of goes, like, really, there are very few truly original ideas in movies. Going back to the Dawn movies, it's like it's all inspired by something, whether it's theater, whether it's story books, stories, even going back to the silent era, it's like you see inspirations from different culture and different different entertainments of the time feed into the movies that people were making. I mean, look, let's talk about Star Wars. The fact of the matter is, it's like that's not an original idea. It's like George Lucas has been very upfront about the inspiration of Flash Gordon serials and Kurosawa and that, and Rares of the Lost Ark. I mean, that was another one inspired by serials, but I think part of where that gets lost is the fact that you see movies come after seismic movies like that just take the hint of, oh, this must be what audiences want, and they think they want the surface as opposed to what inspired the whole idea is those films were inspired new takes on movies, things that Lucas and Spielberg loved, not just, oh, we're going to do this adventure because of the fact that people want adventure now.
Right. And I feel like we're in a weird moment right now, maybe thanks to like the cinema sins and all that kind of stuff where people are like trying to beat movies and, they like to like lord it over it that I caught that inspiration. So obviously this movie's bad and I'm better than it. And that does nothing like constructive. That doesn't like help the situation, doesn't help your own enjoyment of anything. And it's like, it's like that's what I love about doing the show is finding those connections and celebrating those connections.
Yeah. And well, I mean, and part of the biggest issue with CinemaSins is the idea that, pointing out like things like continuity errors in films means that, oh, there's a continuity error, that means it's bad. Well, guess what? There are continuity errors in pretty much all of the great movies of all time. So
absolutely,
what exactly are you going to be enjoying if all you're doing is nitpicking? But exactly. No, you're absolutely right. And I know, especially with the Batman, because of the fact that was a super episode with like multiple people on there. It wasn't just you and I talking about the movie. That really kind of challenged me to not only think about the film in terms of, well, what did I like about it, but why did I like this? And what things seem to inspire it? Like we talked about the score by Michael Giacchino. And, the fact that there were times where it seemed to be building off of stuff that Danny Elfman did and stuff that Hans Zimmer did in earlier iterations of Batman. And then I was amazed that I wasn't the only one who brought The Godfather as a reference.
Yeah, sure.
That really kind of surprised me because of the fact that I understand why other people would see that because of the fact that, it's a crime film and, naturally there are going to be if you're making a crime film, fundamentally, chances are you're going to be inspired by The Godfather in one way or another. But it's like, I love that both of us basically looked at it from a different perspective. And it's like, when I thought about it, I was thinking of the world building. I was thinking about how big the film seemed versus how small the world really was. And that's, I think, the thing that struck me so much about what Matt Reeves seemed to be inspired by with The Godfather. I mean, of course, this isn't to say all of our puzzle pieces are going to be something that, definitely the filmmaker had in mind.
Sure.
We're speculating. We're giving our own subjective opinions on this as far as this is what we see in the film as opposed to this is definitively what the filmmakers got in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I don't have like a PhD in film or something like that. So it's like, it reminded me of it. They must have been inspired by it. It's like, it's close enough.
But I mean, and the thing is, it's like it's one of those, working on a podcast like that and talking about, that's one of the things I love about talking with other people about movies, especially people like yourself and others whom I've shared the mic with, because of the fact that it's like, I feel like I'm always going to get an interesting perspective on film when I talk to people. And the ways, and they're obviously can bring their own perspectives to films and make it in a way and do it in a way that will make me think. And that's one of the things I love about doing podcasting, and one of the reasons I'm glad that I got into it as opposed to just writing my own thoughts down. It's like that's entertaining and that's enriching in one way, but in another way, you do want to have that discussion. You do want to have that debate, but you also don't want to have that be, I'm just going to disagree and, talk shit about a movie because of the fact that I have a voice for it. It's like, I'd much rather have a conversation, even if I disagree with the person, that makes me think, well, okay, so why do they feel that way versus how I feel about it? And that's one of the things that's just really wonderful about this medium and this platform.
I agree, absolutely. A conversation, it's fun before, during, and after.
Yeah. what are some of, before we get into your music, what are some of, we're about halfway into the year now. What are some of your favorite movies that you've seen this year?
Well, we did just do a top 10 episode, and so I'll have to like refer back to that because that is, definitely some of the best stuff that I've seen. My number one was Top Gun Maverick, which is a pretty big surprise to me considering I didn't exactly love the original Top Gun, but it shouldn't have been a surprise because of how amazing Tom Cruise's recent, output has been. The Mission Impossible films and everything have just been so good. So it shouldn't really have been a surprise. Another definite surprise is Michael Bay's Ambulance, which is just so ridiculous and so over the top. And, that's what you would expect from him, but then you wouldn't expect it to necessarily all come together in a way that's like actually good. And it really is. It's great. What else? Windfall was a nice little surprise on Netflix that I feel like not enough people liked or at least didn't see as a little three-hander, just Jason Segel, Jesse Plemons, and Lily Collins in a house, and it's like a little kind of darkly comic single location thriller. I really like that. Beavis and Butthead was great. it's just a 90-minute episode of Beavis and Butthead, but it's really, really good episode of Beavis and Butthead. I would go with that. One that didn't make my list because I hadn't seen it yet. I just watched it this past week while I was at home sick with COVID. But Good Luck to You, Leo Grand is really good. That's a really good one. My guest had brought it up on his top 10, and so I went ahead and watched it. And great movie. There's been a lot of good stuff this year.
Yeah, it really has been a strong year. Part of it is, for me, is, I've seen a lot of, like, I saw Leo Grand at Sundance this year. Mm-hmm. So, I saw it very early on. But, yeah, you're right. Especially, it's like you brought up Top Gun and you brought up Ambulance. This year, it feels like for action has been unusually good for Hollywood.
Yeah,
at least
I agree.
Especially if you include something like RRR, which is just absolutely phenomenal. You look at, and I actually just watched a sniper war drama from Ukraine today, Sniper the White Raven, that Well Go USA just brought out. And, that was one that I really responded to as well because, and it's interesting to see the way these filmmakers really lean into the action tropes and the typical action formula, but the ways they push it in specific ways. And I think especially something like Top Gun did that with the fact that they made the aerial sequences as spectacular as they did. There were some times where the drone cinematography was too much for me in Ambulance, but at the same time, there are also moments in that movie where you could only get those shots with a drone, and it just makes you go, holy shit, this is absolutely insane. And you're right about Bay, where it's like, I'm as hot and cold on Bay as anybody, but I'd be lying if I didn't say Ambulance thoroughly enjoyed me. I was thoroughly entertained by Ambulance because of the fact that it really did seem like, it kind of seemed like it seemed like a return to like this stripped down type of Michael Bay that started out with like Bad Boys and The Rock, but stylistically the modern Michael Bay.
Sure. Yeah, all the tricks of what he can do now, but with some of the attention to detail of his earlier stuff.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm on your by David Rosen website, and you've got other podcasts that you produce as well. And it's interesting to see just how varied your interests are, and you also have Awesome Movie Year, where you guys
Yeah.
where you guys talk about like specific years and go through some of the big titles and stuff like that. And it's just really impressive. It's really impressive just how much you've been able to accomplish with all of the different things that you have going on.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I stay very busy. But yeah, Awesome Movie Year is starting its 12th season this week, today actually, at the time of recording, on the films of 1992. And like you said, yeah, every season is a different year in cinema. And it's hosted by a film critic named Josh Bell and a filmmaker / comedian named Jason Harris. And then I am the producer of the show, although I appear on mic a little bit here and there as well. But yeah, it's a really fun show and like a totally different format for talking about movies. A totally different kind of show, but also really fun to make. And I have produced other podcasts as well. I actually just edited a podcast this week for somebody, a first-time client. So I like producing and editing podcasts and hope to do more of it.
Okay. So with that though, let's move on to you as a composer, because I mean, I know, and the first question I want to ask is, what led you into music? What led you into deciding that you wanted to compose music?
I started off just as I was graduating high school, so a long time ago. but I was trying to basically emulate the like industrial artists that I loved, the like Nine Inch Nails and Ministry and Front 242 and KMFDM, all that kind of stuff. Were the artists that I was trying to basically just make music like, just because I had heard that it was the kind of thing you can just do, with a computer. And I was a computer guy, I was big into computers. And so whereas actual instruments were, scary to me, messing around on a computer was not. And so I was like, I could maybe do this, but at first it was much harder than I anticipated, and it did not sound anything like the people that were inspiring me. And so I kind of went in these like weird tangents where first I ended up doing more like rap and hip hop stuff because it was like more accessible to me. And I was producing some rappers, and I did a bunch of different kinds of rap projects with those kind of tracks that I was making. But then my stuff started getting more, cinematic sounding, and that led me. At first, I was just making it just to make it, but eventually, friends of friends, or somebody would hear that I made music and they needed something. One thing led to another, and I was scoring various short films and things like that. And then my music started, because of the work and because of like really pushing myself to do a good job on those projects. My music started getting better, and then I was able to start putting out these albums of instrumental music that are more in line with what I saw myself as when I first started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's always, I know from personal experiences in terms of my beginnings to compose, and I completely understand the fact that it's like, you have this idea in your head of wanting to emulate some of the composers and musicians that inspired you. Yeah. But when you start to work through your own ideas, it sounds like nothing that they would do. Yeah. I mean, I have, it's funny because of the fact that I've got an album of that's essentially a Western. It's a musical Western, and it was inspired by like the Ennio Morricone spaghetti Western scores and stuff like that, but it really does. But if you listen to it, a lot of it sounds very much like traditional Western ideas. It's very little that is inspired, sounds like Morricone. But,
right. It's funny when that happens. It sometimes it becomes like happy accidents where it's like, I swear I was trying to sound like Nine Inch Nails on this song, but somehow it turned into this weird ambient, thing that doesn't sound anything like them. And but at the same time, it's pretty cool. Like, and it's like things just kind of work in their own direction. It's hard to say exactly how your inspiration will actually take you once you sit down.
Yeah. So you started after high school. Had you played an instrument? Had you studied music? Were you in band or anything like that?
Not really. I had taken, some piano lessons as a kid, and then I took some private guitar lessons at one point in high school, but nothing where I was, able to play live or anything like that. Just playing around on keys and strumming around on the guitar, and nothing where I was ever like in a band or anything like that. It was just very basic knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, and that's the thing that's kind of interesting about music nowadays. I mean, especially with the technology that we've had for the past 20, 30 years now, where it's like it does, to a certain extent, it does make it easier for non-musicians, or at least non-practicing musicians, to get into music and try to create music themselves. But at the same time, I think having that base, at least a very basic sense of music and performance and what that goes into that, even if you've never performed live, I think is definitely important to be able to have under your belt to really start to build yourself as a composer and as a musician.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be somewhere where all that stuff comes from. Not you don't want to end up just being the guy that's just like, it sounds cool, and that's the only reason I'm putting these particular notes and sounds together.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, granted, there are times where I do that as well, but one of the things there are, for me, there are times where I will be very methodical and very much writing out everything, either putting pencil to paper, or putting it in my notation software, but there are also times where I am more improvisation and just sort of going off of a feel that I have for what a piece should sound like. And, but at the same time, it's like, then I know my musicianship comes in my experience performing trombone and being in band and, being in ensembles comes into where it's like I'm thinking back on what a piece should sound like. And it's like, if you listen to my music, even a lot of the really hard electronic stuff does sound very classically inspired. Like you can tell that idea is there as far as the sort of a classical tradition of musicianship and the way the performance plays out.
Yeah, to this point, one of my favorite composers is Clint Mansell, and I got a chance to meet him. This was like 10 years ago or something like that at a BMI music like expo thing, and one of the most inspiring things that he said when I met him is that he's not classically trained. Yeah. And when you think of Clint Mansell's music, it just sounds so beautiful and lush and like, just awesome. And like, you're like, oh, that's just awesome. Like, he's just making music that sounds right, you know, and it doesn't matter how it's made. It matters what ends up being made from it.
Yeah, I mean, I adore Clint Mansell as a composer. I mean, going all the way back to Pi, and I know like for Pi came out like right around the time that I started to compose music myself, and because of the fact that so much of it is electronic, what he was able to do with very simple synthesized sounds, and is just remarkable in that film. It goes well with some of the songs that Aronofsky does in that, but at the same time, it has its own personality, but it also gets to as as static as it sounds, as monotonous as it sounds, it also gets to the emotional energy of that film. To where when the next big jump for him is something like Requiem for a Dream with Aronofsky, it's not surprising at all, and it still has that. It still has that. It still has that feel, but it's drastically different. You can kind of hear him starting to get more into a classical sound, and then his score for The Fountain is one of my all-time favorite soundtracks of all time. I absolutely adore that score. But and that just, it's one of those things where the evolution between those three scores, but at the same time, it makes all the sense in the world that those three scores are all from the same artist.
Right, absolutely.
Who are some? I mean, you mentioned some of the artists that you were inspired by and wanted to try to sound like when you came out, when you first started to make music. Now that you've kind of settled into your own style, and even when you and especially when you are thinking about film music and working on a film, are there any particular composers that stand out to you as somebody that you're inspired by?
Well, I mean, first of all, with all my music, I'm always kind of chasing The Cure and Depeche Mode. They're my biggest inspirations, really, when it comes to everything I do. But as far as like actual film music composers, I mean, of course, Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, of course. But I also really love Ben Salisbury and Jeff Barrow's work, and Ex Machina and all of those films with Alex Garland. Michael Giacchino's amazing. Nicholas Britell is one of the best doing it right now. That If Beale Street Could Talk score is just incredible. And I do tend to work in a lot of like horror and like darker stuff like that. But when I get the opportunities to do more drama type stuff, definitely that's in mind when I'm working on those kinds of things. Bear McCreary is awesome too.
Yeah.
Talking about like blending like new style with more classic style. I mean, that really kind of, combines the best of both worlds.
Yeah. No, McCreary is somebody who I think kind of gets lost in the conversation, but the fact is, it's like he's been such a stalwart as far as TV, more so than movies for a long time. I mean, some friends of mine were watching the reboot of Battlestar Galactica from the aughts, and he scored that, and we've been watching Outlander together, which is him as well. And then of course there's The Walking Dead, but he also did like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the beginning, and he also did Godzilla King of the Monsters. And yeah, he's somebody who I love. He's somebody who he's an example of he's a great example of a composer who's very much a chameleon, who can go from genre to genre, from type of show to type of to different types of shows, even within the same genre, and do something very different and very unique in both of them. And it's really something.
You know who else I think is that way is Lauren Bouth. Also somebody who just, kind of takes ideas that I would associate with other composers maybe, but does them so damn well whenever he steps up and scores something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's funny. Darren Lundberg and I, we were just talking about Hans Zimmer on the last episode of the podcast. And, Balfe is part of that remote control family, along with other composers like Ramin Djawadi and Harry Gregson Williams back in the day, and John Powell. And, I think that's a lot of that does come from Zimmer and how he approaches film music in a lot of ways. And, but yeah, he's really impressed me with his work for Top Gun Maverick, for Mission Impossible Fallout. I really am looking forward to seeing, and I mean, even Black Widow, which was a fine movie, but it wasn't one of his best scores, but at the same time, there's still some interesting things in that score too.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, and those are some great examples of composers right there, and it's just really it's really interesting to kind of get to know composers through the film, through the inspirations that they have, and all the varied inspirations they have. If somebody was to wanting to get started in listening to your music, is there a particular place that you think would be a good place to start?
I mean, I don't want to give Spotify any extra streams, but all my stuff is there. So, but there's also my, if you just want to know about my composing work specifically, I have a reel on my website which has clips from some of the best stuff that I've worked on in the last few years. It was made in 2020, so it was a couple years old at this point, but I think has like a really good mix of the kind of stuff I've done. But my albums, they're all, I think, representative of what I've been able to do. I think my most recent full-length album, which is just self-titled, it's called David Rosen, is probably my best album, but at the same time, I think they all have stuff that, I think really represents me well. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gotten that deep into listening to your music just yet. But I mean, what I have, I've really just enjoyed listening to. And I mean, part of it is because of the fact that stylistically, it's the type of stuff that I've really gravitated towards over the years, in terms of electronica and techno to a certain extent. But I mean, more soundscapes and more just that type of idea. And I definitely am really, I definitely am looking forward to getting into more and more over the coming weeks and months, and just keeping up with your work over the coming years.
Yeah, defining genre is so difficult nowadays, especially for a composer like me. It's film score inspired, new age, alternative, electronica, industrial, rock, stuff. Like it's all of the above,
Yeah. And it's I mean, that is one of the hardest things. It's like I would have said like electronica, ambient, new age, all of that.
Oh, stuff. I left out ambient. Yeah.
I mean, it's soundscapes, but yeah, I mean, a lot of it is infused by film music, and mainly because film music is my favorite genre to listen to. But it's definitely check out David's stuff. It's really, really wonderful. What is and you have talked about, you did talk a little bit, you touched on the fact that you've worked on short films and stuff like that. Is there a particular type of story that when somebody approaches you about doing music for their film that you find yourself gravitating towards, or are you just interested in the opportunity of scoring a film?
I'm interested in all different kinds of stories for sure, and that really allows me to flex my abilities and try new things. I do tend to gravitate towards darker stuff, whether that means like a dark drama or a horror movie or a thriller or just something weird. Like dark is kind of my natural place to work on music. So it all kind of, and that's usually my number one note is ease up on the darkness a little bit, Dave. That's the number one thing. But luckily the majority of what I've gotten a chance to work on has been like that. And yeah, I've worked on like 30 or more short films and about 8 features now.
Okay.
as well as games and commercials and TV and a bunch of other stuff too.
What is for games? What is because of how different of an aesthetic and how different of a storytelling medium video games are to film? What are some of the differences in approaching a game versus approaching a film?
Well, I haven't done one in a while, but when the games that I have worked on, like the biggest difference is, that for the most part, you're dealing with either loop-based stuff or things with stems that the programmers can kind of make come in and out as needed. So like obviously loops are self-explanatory, it's just stuff that could be looped very easily. But some of the game projects that I worked on would have like where when I was finished, I would export things in various layers, and that way it could be triggered where like, oh, there's a bad guy nearby, so the bass is going to come in. And that would like layer in organically as it's happening. And so thinking about things like that, it's definitely a different kind of experience. And there are more things that you have to think about other than make a good piece of music that fits this project. You have to think about more of those kind of aspects as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I've only done a couple shorts and I just finished locking my first feature score. And it's funny because of the fact that you said you tend to gravitate towards kind of the dark side musically speaking. I kind of am more on the serious side as well. And it's funny because my first feature film score is for a romantic comedy, which is a completely different transition. But at the same time, I took it because of the fact that I've been a big fan of the filmmaker over the years. As a film critic, I've respected his work and really enjoyed his work, but also it was something different. It was an opportunity to challenge myself into doing something a bit lighter, but also, following in some of those musical instincts that I try to do, and there were, and I'm going to write about it and stuff like that on my own, but it was such a challenge because of the fact that it's like, there are some things that you associate with comedy in terms of comedy scores. You don't want to lean on them too much, but at the same time, it's like, well, how far can you go with getting away from them? And, but ultimately it's all about the heart. It's all about telling the story and getting to the heart of the story. So that's one of the things. That's ultimately all that matters. And if your score can do that, that's the most important thing.
I had an interesting experience recently. The feature that I just scored a month ago, it's called Move Me No Mountain, and just had its first premiere screening, and it's now going to be doing the festival run and all that, and hopefully people will be able to see it soon. But what we did on this film is actually, aside from like songs, because there are some like songs sourced that are played in the film as well, but it's actually the composing duties were split. And I'm scoring all of the current scenes in the like the non-flashback scenes, like the actual time scenes in the movie, and then the other composer was scoring the flashbacks. And we actually know each other, me and the composer Travis Lohman here in Las Vegas. And it was an interesting thing to not only to collaborate with another composer, which I've never really had to do and just never have done. But, just usually that's not the case when scoring films, and the interesting thing was like, because those flashback scenes that Travis was scoring were just like 100% melodic piano based, and like that was the sound that the director wanted for those flashbacks. Anytime my score would get a little bit melodic, the director would be like, I'm loving it, but can we maybe lose some of that melody so it doesn't blend in with what Travis is doing? And that was like an interesting I guess what would the word be, like, restriction, I guess, to what I was doing. It's like, even though it's a drama and it's a pretty heavy drama, you kind of can't pull on the heartstrings too much because you can't bring in any melody.
Right.
So, it's just, it's a great experience though, because it's trying new things. It's, doing things in a different way.
Yeah, that does sound fascinating. It's like the idea of, I mean, there are certainly scores that don't rely on melody as much, but at the same time, it's interesting. It's interesting that you have that experience where it's like somebody else is essentially taking care of the melodic aspect, and like you kind of have to keep yourself from going in that direction, which I think as a musician as a composer is the natural way where we automatically start thinking about themes and melodies. And, what is that going to look like if you kind of take that way to a certain extent, and how are you going to tie that together?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I'm very happy with how it all, ended up working out. And, I'm looking forward to people getting to see the film, but it's definitely a little bit of a different experience. All these, I mean, I've been doing this now over 15 years, really close to 20, and so this far on doing something like so differently, it was an interesting experience.
I can definitely imagine. David, thank you very much for your time today. I'm glad we were finally able to have you on the podcast, because I have been interested to talk to you both as a fellow podcaster as well as a fellow composer. And where can people just reiterate where can people find you online?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on. This was great. People can find Piecing It Together and the other podcasts wherever they listen to podcasts, all the major podcast apps, and at piecingpod.com, which also has links to all the other podcasts I'm involved with. And my music is by davidrosen.com. You can check out my albums. They're under my name, David Rosen, on all the streaming services. And I will be putting out a new single in a couple of weeks here, so keep an eye out for that. And a new album probably by the end of the year.
Excellent. Sounds good. And I will definitely be looking forward to that. It's been great seeing your updates on Twitter about creating some of the new music, and it's like, okay, I've got the beginning and I've got the end. Now what's in the middle? It's interesting how sometimes that's the case when it comes to creating music. But no, David, thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to thank David for joining me on the episode tonight. It was really great to talk to him finally on the podcast, and check out Piecing It Together and his other podcasts, and you can especially check out his music. Like I said, what I've listened to, I've really enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper into it. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. I've got a really interesting lineup for the rest of the year. Going to have a lot of return guests, a lot of interesting topics, and a lot of filmmakers that we're going to be discussing for the first time. And I'm looking forward to that. Once again, check out Sonic Cinema Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Bandcamp for my score for Player PhD, as well as just in general for my movie reviews, www.sonic-cinema.com. Thank you very much.